Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, as you heard, we did ask the Conservative Party for an interview this evening, but they refused, giving instead a one-sentence response, which you can see in that report, and which you did see in that report. Earlier, I spoke to the QC Gavin Miller. He's a leading expert in electoral law with matrix chambers. I asked him first what the rules are on expenses.
We have a very old set of statutory rules dating back to the 19th century that pin responsibility on candidates and agents to file an accurate return of their expenses after the election, one which shows them within the limit. If they don't, it's not an accurate return or it's a dishonest return, there are offences committed. We also have a policy of running short time limits for civil claims based on overspending or criminal prosecutions. Criminal time period is 1 year. So very often offences are committed, but they can't be prosecuted because nobody discovers until more than a year after the event that there's been a breach of the law. But on the face of it, if your report is right, these returns look like they're clearly wrong.
But there can be no action taken because the statute of limitations has expired.
Well, there can be no action taken for these very particular election law offences. We call them corrupt and illegal practices.
What is the law when it comes to what happens to people who might have been responsible for this?
I mean, if you asked the ordinary voter, the ordinary person in the street, they would say, well, that's all very well. But if people with a lot of money to spend on elections are orchestrating big campaigns, spending a lot of money on them, accommodation, administration expenses, and so on and so forth, and knowing that the returns their candidate and agents are putting in aren't accurate, but they have really spent more than that, the law would be an ass, wouldn't it, if it couldn't find a means of pursuing those responsible for that, at the very least investigating them. You make a representation to a returning officer. If it's wrong accidentally or because you don't know the law, there's no problem. But if it's deliberately wrong, and deliberately wrong repeatedly, and there are a group of people who know what they're doing and know why they're doing it to make some sort of gain for their party at the election, to spend more than they're allowed to without being caught out, I would say that's worthy of an investigation by the police, and I think most people would.
But it sounds to me as if you're saying, well, I'm sorry, but I doubt if anything will be done this time.
Look, I'm very sceptical about this, I'm afraid. I don't think our legislation works. I don't think it's worked for years. I think there's been overspending without people being caught for many years. And I think we need to bring the legislation up to date. But in that gap that exists at the moment, there shouldn't be any problem if there has been dishonesty by agreement in finding criminal offences to investigate.
But I mean, to say the least, there is UKIP who will feel that they were, to some extent, done out of some of the action as a result of this, or they could argue that they might have been. And then, of course, there are going to be voters who are going to say, you're telling me this happens all the time.
People say, look, it's a grey area. I don't know if I'm the candidate or the agent, whether this, and this was spent. I don't know if this was lawful or not lawful. I relied on so-and-so. So-and says I relied on so-and-so. It's very difficult for a prosecuting authority, for the police.
Is there any legal power in this country which would say, I'm sorry, the law's an ass, we're going to fix it?
No, but European authorities have said for many years now that our archaic election law is in need of updating, that it's open to voting fraud, and the expenses and the expenditure regime is completely unregulated. So we're being watched from outside by the EU and the Council of Europe, and there have been some very serious criticisms about our law, and we can't go on hiding from them forever.
Gavin Miller, QC, and the UKIP MP Douglas Carswell, who fought that and won Clacton by-election, is with me now. Douglas Carswell, wasn't so long ago that you were a Tory MP. Did you know the party was up to this?
No, I didn't, and frankly, it's shocking. We ought to be shocked about this. I hope we haven't become so cynical about the political process that we just shrug our shoulders and think this is acceptable behaviour.
But you heard Gavin Miller, the QC who specialises in electoral law, he says everybody's up to it.
I'm sorry, I don't think that's good enough. And that's the sort of thing MPs said at the time of the expenses scandal. It's simply wrong to create a... Look, this is elementary stuff. Anyone who runs a party knows that in a by-election, you have a £100,000 spending limit. It's not just that they seem to have flouted that. Look, for heaven's sake, if they're not going to be straight about how they win elections, these are the people who want to run our country. It's simply intolerable. You have to have a law that makes sure that you cannot, in effect, have an unfair advantage and buy an election, and you have to enforce it.
But the Conservatives say, look, we've accounted for everything and it's all above board and it's fine. Can that be true?
Well, you have the evidence sitting in front of you. Your investigation, and fantastic job it is, suggests that there are some questions that they certainly need to answer.
So what are you going to do about it? What's UKIP going to do? I mean, can you sue? Can you get the police to prosecute?
First of all,
what are you going to do?
Nigel was absolutely right when on the night of the Newark by-election he raised this issue. Once again, he's been prescient and ahead of the curve. But, I think what we need to do is look at whether or not the Electoral Commission has enough powers to oversee this. Look,
will you be raising this in the House?
I will certainly be raising it with the Electoral Commission. I think the Electoral Commission needs extra powers so that they can deal with this.
You can't have a law. It's very interesting you should say that, because, in fact, we did go to them and they said, look, we know better than anybody. We do not have enough powers.
And I think that is the problem. Look,
But are you ever going to get MPs to vote to police themselves?
I think you can do that. I mean, part of the reason why we've seen this huge apparent overspend is the dire state of the big corporate parties means that when they have a by-election, they can't bus in volunteers because they don't have any, so they have to pay staffers to go and stay in these hotels to do the job. This is not how democracy is supposed to function.
Well, I mean, we are a mere media organisation, a news organisation. Will UKIP be making its own investigation into this?
I'm certainly going to take away the
Here you are, you can have this lot. Here, but they're all yours.
We cannot have a situation where you've got a legal spending limit of £100,000 and in effect a big corporate party can come in and just disregard the rules.
But what are you going to say to your followers tonight? Are we going to say that you're going to take this away and get it investigated? Or are we going to say Douglas Carswell is going to go and talk to the Electoral Commission and not a lot will happen?
Well, I think we need to talk to the Electoral Commission because only if the regulator has the power to investigate, I think we'll get somewhere. We heard from the QC, the chances of the police taking this up are negligible.
Well, but you have the right to call the police's attention to it. Will you be doing that?
I've certainly looked at the Electoral Commission. I'm not sure about the legality of complaining to the police. I think there's a time limit of a year on that.
But there are other laws that could be investigated, under which this could be investigated.
Certainly something needs to be done because you cannot have a £100,000 spending limit and parties deliberately and apparently systematically
But I mean, the police can certainly say to you, we don't have the power, but you could test that. Are you going to ask the police? Are you going to ask the police to investigate this?
Well, let's see. I've just watched the report. I need to reflect on it, but I think something definitely needs to be done. You cannot have a situation where big corporate parties can throw vast amounts of money. It's just not how democracy is supposed to function.
Douglas Carswell, thank you for coming in. Tonight's main news, this programme has obtained evidence that in 3 key by-elections, the Conservative Party seemingly ignored the rules governing election spending and apparently failed to declare tens of thousands of pounds spent on accommodating campaign workers. On this programme, the UKIP MP Douglas Carswell, whose seat was targeted, said he'd be raising it with the Electoral Commission and calling for more powers for the Commission. What reaction, Michael Crick, have you had?
Well, a few minutes ago, our colleague Paul McNamara caught up with the Conservatives' Australian campaign guru, Sir Linton Crosby, as he was attending the Conservative fundraising black and white ball in the City of London.
Mr Crosby, have the Conservatives committed electoral fraud? Do you fancy coming on Channel 4 News and talking to us about our story? Mr Crosby!
So basically a no comment there, and that's pretty much been the Conservatives' reaction. They did say tonight, however, that they had fully complied with the election law in reporting their expenses without explaining the discrepancies that we highlighted in our film tonight.
Will the police be able to investigate this?
Well, it's a tricky issue. The police don't like investigating things like this. They don't like getting involved in political and election matters. On the other hand, the Electoral Commission say that their responsibility is solely national spending. They'll say they'll take a look at our allegations and maybe pass things on to the police. But the Electoral Commission have actually asked the government for more powers, for the powers to look at local spending. And they say that the government hasn't even responded to that request.
And the QC Gavin Miller, who specialises in this, said it's happened a lot.
I've been following this issue for more than 30 years, since I had a dinner 32 years ago with a Liberal agent who told me about all the tricks that they got up to in those days. In the 70s and 80s, it was the Liberals and the Social Democrats. In the new Labour years, I suspect it was Labour that overspent. Now it's the Conservatives who've got the money, apparently, to do this kind of overspending.
Michael Crick.
I've been getting